Hi, this is Pat Johnson, and in this mini lecture, we're going to talk about the topic of conformity. Now, conformity is a concept we use all the time in our everyday language in our lives, so most of you are familiar with conforming, uh, going along with other people, doing what the group does. Let's take a look at our formal definition of conformity. Our author tells us that conformity is adjusting our behavior or thinking to coincide with a group standards. So often when we think about the topic of conformity, we think that conforming is behaving. Sometimes we go along with the group and don't change our thinking about what the group thinks, or we don't change our thinking to what the group thinks. Sometimes we just go along to get along. So make sure you understand it can be just behavior, not always thinking. Now let me give you an example of conformity that I saw one time in my classroom. It's the first day of the semester, and as is typical of first days of the semester, usually before class, students just sit there and stare at the teacher, interact a little bit, but are very quiet. So this particular semester, I decided instead of just sitting there and trying to chat with the students before class in a pretty awkward and uncomfortable silent classroom, I would go to the classroom, turn the lights on, open the door, put welcome on the board, made sure that there was a sign out in the hallway that this was the right classroom. But then I would go back to my office and wait until right before the class was due to start, so I wouldn't have to deal with that awkwardly silent classroom. And right before the class started, I walked down the hallway, and lo and behold, instead of seeing a classroom full of students, I saw about 20 students lined up out in the hallway. And I was really perplexed because I had never seen this behavior in students before. And when I went into the classroom, the students followed me into the classroom, and I introduced myself, and I asked them, why were you all standing out in the hallway instead of being in the classroom where the lights were on and the door was open and welcome was on the board? And they looked at me sheepishly, and they looked at each other, and two of the students chirped up and said, well, we were the first two here and we knew each other, so we just started having a conversation out in the hallway. And the other students kind of started laughing quietly, and one student said, well, hey, I walked up, there was nobody in the classroom, there were two students out in the hallway, and I wasn't sure, so this is my first semester at this college, so I wasn't sure if there was a rule about not going into the classroom, so I just waited out in the hallway. And another student said, well, I walked up, I saw three students standing out in the hallway, and I just did what they did. And this is what happened. And the more and more students were standing out in the hallway, the less likely anyone knew was to actually break the unspoken rule and go into the classroom. So let's switch now and talk about Solomon Asch's classic study in 1951 about conformity. Solomon Asch wanted to study the topic of conformity, and what's interesting is that, first of all, he used deception, and which is fine as long as you debrief and you don't harm your subjects, but he also wanted to give a baseline for where people would not conform. So he used people in his research design called Confederates. Now, Confederates in research sense have nothing to do with North or South or Union or Confederacy. Confederates in research have to do with people who are actually not research subjects. They're part of the research design. They are actors. They are in on it. And so in Asch's study, he used Confederates, and he had people seated around a table. So let's suppose this is a long table. And these are all Confederates, and you are the only subject, and they've come into the classroom ahead of you, they take the first 5 seats, you're kind of forced into this seat, and then another person sits in seat 7. And so again, all of these people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7, are Confederates. They're in on the research. You are the actual only subject in the research. And you think this is going to be the most boring research on the planet, because what you're told is this is a piece of research on visual perception. You are to match lines. So in other words, if this is the test line, you are to say what line matches the test line. We'll call it X. And you are to say, in this case, it would be B. And that's exactly what happens in the first few rounds of the Asch study. Person 1 says it's B, person 2 says it's B, 3 does, 4 does, 5 does. It's your turn. You go along with the group because the group answered correctly, and so does the last person. And that happens a few times. Then what's interesting is another screen is shown up on the board, and people start matching the lines incorrectly. Number 1 gives the incorrect answer. Number 2 says the same thing number 1 did. So does 3, so does 4, so does 5, and now it's your turn. And this is what Asch was really looking for. Would the research subject, again, number 6 is the only actual subject, would the research subject go along with the group when the group was obviously wrong and the research subject knew in their own heart what the right answer was? And lo and behold, about 30% of the subjects went along with the group. They conformed even when the group was obviously wrong. So let's talk about factors affecting our likelihood to conform. First of all, if we feel insecure, if we feel incompetent about the task, we're more likely to conform. In other words, if it's a difficult task or it's something that we're personally not familiar with, we're more likely to conform. And let me give you a personal example. I grew up in the country, middle class. We had a farm, and we lived a pretty basic existence in my childhood. We ate well because we had all that good farm fresh food, but we usually had a plate, a cup of milk, a fork, and a spoon, and a knife, and a napkin, and that's about it. As an adult, I've gone out to some really, really fancy restaurants where there is a salad fork and a dinner fork and a dessert fork and a shrimp fork and this spoon and this knife and that knife and different goblets for different types of wine and water. And I never feel real secure. I never feel real competent in that type of fancy restaurant because that's not the way I grew up. And so when I'm at a fancy restaurant and I'm feeling a little bit insecure, I will look left, I'll look right quietly. I'll see what the people doing next to me are doing, and I will do what the rest of the people are doing because I don't feel confident in a really, really fancy restaurant. All right, another factor in affecting our likelihood to conform is how many people are conforming. When Asch tried it and just had a table and one Confederate, and let's say here you are, and this person gives the wrong answer, you're not likely to conform because that's just one other person, and they could be have visual impairment. They could be just wrong. So you are less likely to conform. But as the number increases, so as we get up closer to 3, 4, 5, 6, we're much more likely to conform. If everyone else agrees, we are much more likely to conform. So again, let's go back to Asch's table, and let's say that here's the setup, here you are, here's the last person, and let's say person 1 gives the wrong answer, person 2 gives the wrong answer, person 3 says, no, wait a second, you two are wrong, and they give the correct answer. Number 4 agrees with person number 1 and 2. Number 5 agrees with person number 1 and 2. But again, person 3 has given the correct answer, and now it is your turn. What Asch found is if everybody else agrees, you're likely to conform. If at least one person breaks that trend, you are less likely to conform. And again, think about this in real life. Forget about line matching. Think about real life. In real life, if you have to stand up for what you believe against a whole group, it can be hard. But if at least one other person agrees with you and will stand by you, it's much easier to go with your own mind and not conform to the group. If we admire the group, if we identify with the group, we are much more likely to conform. If the group is very different from us, if we don't admire the group, though, we are less likely to conform. So let's suppose in the original Asch experiment that people 1 through 5 are very different from you. That could be in age, that could be in gender, that could be in religion, it could be in anything. Let's suppose they're very different from you. You are less likely to conform if they are different from you. The more they are like you, the more you are likely to conform. If we have not committed to a response, in other words, if we have not made up our mind, or if we have not publicly made a statement, we are more likely to conform. And if others are observing us. So if people are watching us and watching us carefully, we are less likely to want to stand out. We are more likely to conform. So read about this in your textbook. You can go to YouTube and see some reenactments of the Asch study. The actual original Asch experiment was not filmed, but there's lots of still photos of it. But there are some great reenactments of the Asch study, and you can see just how confused and frustrated the actual subjects are. So that ends this little mini lecture on conformity.